Hey, everybody, welcome to Behind the Headlines. I'm Lee Camp. Thanks for joining us. I have actually two excellent, great guests for you in this ongoing interview series. If you get a chance, please click subscribe, click thumbs up, leave a comment. All those things are helpful. I'll be highlighting some of the comments as we go. And I'm really excited about this interview. As I have been many in recent weeks. If you didn't catch my interviews with Stella Assange, Julian Assange's wife, or his father, John Shipton, definitely check those out. Richard Wolff, Chris Hedges, so many great interviews. I hope you'll check them out at youtube.com/behind the headlines. But today I speak with two journalists who are doing excellent work, and they're hitting on a beat that is not covered enough, but for significant reasons. It is kind of a third rail of reporting in many ways. And so I am very excited to speak to Taya Graham and Stephen Janis today. And they are with the Real News Network. And they have a great ongoing show called the Police Accountability Report. Welcome.
Hey.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks
and thank you for that great
it.
build-up too.
Yeah,
hold on, I'm trying to get the right screens there. No problem. It's very exciting to have you both on, and huge fan of your work. You guys have been doing this for a while. Actually, I think it was pretty recent, the 4-year anniversary. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. That's very true. As a matter of fact, we have both been reporting on police accountability, police reform for longer than that. But the Police Accountability Report itself has finally had its 4-year anniversary. But we have definitely had a fun time trying to hold police accountable in Baltimore City for me, almost a decade, for him over a decade. And it's made us lots of friends, as you can imagine.
Well, but friends with the right people, but enemies with others. And so I know you say keep police accountable in Baltimore City, but you cover police abuse really across the nation as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. What we've been doing, what we discovered when we started reporting and focusing a lot on our YouTube community is that there's this whole world of cop watchers and auditors, people who actually go out, film the police, as well as test their First Amendment rights in a public space, test their right to record police. And so as we started learning more from that community, interacting with them more, and as we were expanding to national police coverage, we started covering more rural policing. And something that really shocked me, because I grew up in Baltimore City, it's a majority Black city. I think you and your audience have an idea of what police brutality looks like here. Freddie Gray died in 2015. We had the uprising after that. And Baltimore is the home of Dr. David Fowler, the medical examiner who dismissed an unfounded and undetermined dozens, actually hundreds of cases of police brutality that are now being audited.
Just real quick, unlike most cities, Baltimore has now had 2 great series on how terrible their cops are.
Oh, absolutely. I can't forget the Gun Trace Task Force.
Both The Wire and whatever it was called, Our City or something.
It was a homicide, Life on the Streets.
No. We Own This City.
Oh, and We Own
This City. Yes.
Yes, so it's actually a cultural production now.
So now the nation is starting to learn what Baltimore policing is about.
To some extent. I mean, I think the Gun Trace Task Force, which was roughly 8 officers who robbed residents, dealt drugs, stole overtime, I think they give a good idea of what Baltimore City policing is about.
I would just add this. I mean, one thing I've learned covering police problems and corruption, let's call it, is that the whole idea informing the idea of police corruption is that there is a state of policing that is not corrupt. And I think the reason I've come, and I think that's a false assumption. Policing only reflects the values of the community it serves in many ways. And when I say that, I mean, it doesn't reflect the community. It reflects the people who have the power, the money, the capital to impose policing on communities that don't have it. So I think when we talk about police corruption, we're really talking about the corruption of inequality on a community manifest in policing itself. So it's a different concept because, look, I report on police corruption for so long, and it never really changes, and that's because the underlying conditions in the community the police are tasked to serve doesn't change. I mean, look what happened in Memphis. They had a unit called Scorpion.
Right.
You know, and the Tyron Nichols death, and you know, what on earth was that? And what you know, what country do you live in where people jump out of a car, drag you out of a car, and start beating you?
Yeah, using SWAT team tactics for traffic enforcement.
And that case is not isolated. That's what the gun trace task force used to do, things called jump outs, where they see a group of kids hanging out, they drive up to them and jump out, and see who ran. Whoever ran, they chase. I mean, that's not American, constitutional, democratic institution. So go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's exactly what happened to Freddie Gray. Freddie Gray and a police officer locked eyes, and Freddie ran. And that is all the police officer needed as probable cause to chase down this boy and lead to his death in the back of that van. So we have a very rich history of police brutality, police corruption. I mean, we're under a consent decree right now for unconstitutional policing, which makes me wonder how things are going to go in Louisville, as they are having their own Department of Justice investigation, which came up with a lot of the same things we saw in Baltimore: racist and unconstitutional policing, brutality visited upon African Americans being arrested at higher rates, being given longer sentences, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We had the same thing here in Baltimore. I can only hope that if they're put under consent decree, that they get perhaps better results than we do.
And part of the problem is exactly what's in the title of your show. There is really no accountability. I mean, it's incredibly rare that police officers, so to throw out some of the numbers, police killed more than, ever this past year, over 1,200 people. But the Lancet Medical Journal says it's actually double that, because if you actually analyze deaths across the country, over half of police killings don't get written down as police killings. Mm-hmm. So you're talking, 2,400 people a year, and the number of police that get prosecuted for murder, even attempted prosecution for murder, is minuscule. And then the number that get convicted, I mean, even NBC News found that over a 15-year period, it was 3 cops had been actually convicted of murder. So it is 0.001% or something actually get charged with murder. And there is no accountability.
Yeah, well, remember, I mean, the threshold is very low for a police officer to take your life. Yes. Reasonably, a reasonable person in that position, fear for their safety, very nebulous things. And I think it was revealing that the body camera footage of the death of Tyron Nichols, it was very revealing, because the officers kept yelling, "Stop resisting, stop." They were kind of establishing this narrative that is used to evade accountability by saying, "Yeah, I was in fear for my life. He was resisting, blah 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 blah," and they've learned the language of our legal system, which is really based upon allowing them to make decisions. And I mean, we were probably the only country. I don't know how many countries there are where people can get pulled over for a taillight and 60 seconds later end up dead. I don't think any other country, I don't know if other democracies would actually tolerate that, is what you're talking about. We have literally given police the license in any situation, so long as they judge it, not us, and not, like you said, not a system of accountability. It used to be in the 50s and the 60s in Baltimore, if you killed a person as a cop, you were charged with a homicide automatically. You had to go in front of a judge and convince the judge that it was justified, and that's totally dropped now. So when you say accountability, over time we have slowly, whichever we want to do it, evolved a system where accountability is less and less part of the process. And of course, as we report on our show, oftentimes when people try to hold police accountable, police retaliate, have the ability to retaliate, and so either through another arrest or whatever. So the system of accountability in this country is very, it's broken, to say the least.
Right. I'm glad you bring that up about when people try and hold police accountable, they often then become the victims of further police attacks. You guys have done several wonderful segments on that, where someone goes to try and report a police officer, put in a complaint, and they're immediately harassed, sometimes arrested. This is years ago, so I don't remember all the details, but I remember doing a segment for Redacted Tonight on how each of the people that had filmed these, now infamous moments of police killings. So Freddie Gray, the Ortega, I believe, was the name of the man who filmed Eric Garner.
Yes.
They had all been, and there was 2 or 3 other examples. been arrested, harassed, put in, Ortega spent years in prison for, basically they come up with charges to put these people away.
Yeah. And I think it shows the power of policing that I don't think we really measure. Really in places like Baltimore, and this is true in many places, I mean, it's like a non-constitutional zone because that kind of stuff happens. I remember one of the first videos of police brutality I reported on, the kid who shot the video ended up getting arrested on a totally bogus drug charge and ended up spending 5-6 years in prison. I interviewed him later about it, and he had done nothing. And it was really, really bad. I mean, it's not as bad as it was, but that kind of shows you that's a demonstration of power, right? I mean, when we do something that's called witness tampering or harassing, but sorry, Tay, I didn't want to take
No,
Go
please.
ahead.
No, I was just thinking, when you were talking about the retaliation that a community experienced, sometimes it's not even that direct, that there's not a one-to-one. This person took a video of body, cell phone camera video, and then they are continually harassed by police, although that does happen. I was thinking of Baltimore City being put under the era of zero tolerance, where people were arrested for spitting on a sidewalk, urinating in public, having an open container of beer, or failure to ID, being in a high crime neighborhood and not being able to produce ID to prove that you belonged in that neighborhood. And that would result in your arrest and being taken down to central booking. And I was thinking there's another way that police prevent the community from speaking up. And if that's sort of continual low-level harassment, those continual arrests that just erode your political efficacy and let you know that the government doesn't care about you, that you don't have any power over the government, and that you sure as heck aren't going to come forward and bring evidence against these police officers who've been terrorizing your community, even if it's for these small nuisance crimes, that erodes your power.
And there's also the racist aspect of this, which is that many of those smaller crimes are things you could get anybody on,
Absolutely.
I remember the number that 4% of the arrests of people walking around with an open beverage in New York City is white people, because it's not that only 4% are white people walking around with open beverages. It's that it's only really used and used for arrest against people of color. So you take those small little crimes, loitering and stuff, and you use them as a reason to just arrest people you wanted to, the cops wanted to arrest anyway.
People underestimate, well, I don't know if they underestimate, but the power of arrest, is dramatic and traumatic. Yeah. And it's often called as a tool, something as a way to mediate something. I mean, it's casually used by law enforcement, and it's casually used in the lexicon of politicians, but it's the most traumatic thing you can do to a person besides killing them, in the sense that you're taking their freedom away. And in a constitutional democracy, it is utterly, probably the most, really scary power, in the sense that, as you point out, it leads to many things. It allows police to police space. It allows police to police behavior. It allows police to police, like we said, political efficacy, the ability to, fight back against politicians, et cetera, et cetera. So it is a very potent tool. And when you introduce it in a democracy, it can become insidious. And I think that's one of the things that we don't really think about when police are making 2 million arrests a year. Maybe we shouldn't be arresting people for small things. Well, I don't think we should, but that happens all the time.
The one thing I would want to add to that is that this is also a form of economic exploitation. This is a form of wealth extraction. Right. And we have seen this not just in our reportings in big cities like mine, but also in rural areas. And so there was one gentleman we spoke to, Chase Hasagawa, and he was on the side of a road with a broken car. He was so unfortunate, been out there all night. Well, police came and asked him for his ID. He'd been up all night waiting for a tow truck, and he said, "I don't have to give you my ID." Well, that simple statement led to the police becoming aggressive, putting him in cuffs. He ended up being arrested. His car ended up being impounded. That led to him not being able to pay to get his car out the impound lot. He had to pay for his bail. Of course, he's potentially going to have attorney fees. They're going to be court costs. And now he can't get to work. He needs that truck to be able to drive to work. So these interventions, these arrests, not only erode your political efficacy, but they extract wealth from the community and make working people's lives more difficult. And most of us are just, one calamity away, one health calamity, one car accident away from having our entire, $2,400 savings wiped out. And then we're back to subsistence living. And so many people, an arrest shakes the foundation of their lives and can put people who are already on shaky economic ground in real trouble.
Thank you. Yeah, those are all great points. I'm getting some excellent questions from people watching. I don't normally jump to their questions so quickly, but people have a lot of things they want to know from you, such as they would. One of them would like you to address what you think of Cop City, the protest going on there in Atlanta. So.
Actually, well, we're going down to Cop City not next week, but the week after. You know, we wrote about it in our show that's going to be broadcast next Thursday. But you know, I think Cop City, we talked about it because it's an expression of the idea that somehow putting all this money into law enforcement is going to improve people's lives, and I don't think there's any proof of that. But it's also showing, because I think very importantly, like 70 million of the financing is coming from anonymous donors. How much let's call them the rich, wealthy elite invest in law enforcement, I think, to mediate and sustain their what I would call unequal share of our economy. And I think that just demonstrates the fact that Cop City, where they're going to learn all these urban combat techniques and everything, is being funded by elite donors by what, 12 or 10?
Yeah, I think it's roughly 12 anonymous elite donors who are providing 2/3 of roughly $60 million worth of the funds. Other money is actually supposed to be coming from the city of Atlanta, is supposed to be supporting this. And I think also DeKalb County. What's amazing to me is that this Cop City Center is supposed to be training police officers in urban warfare. There's demolitions training. There's high-speed car chase training. They're teaching them how to rappel. They're teaching them how to kick in doors and perform urban combat. Does that sound like that's going to lead to the type of community policing that it seems like most of America is asking for? It sounds like this is militarized policing. And understandably, people who live in Atlanta say, you know what, the brunt of this is going to be turned on us. But what concerns me is that there's not a lot of mainstream media attention. And I think people don't realize that Cop City is coming to their town too, because over 43% of those cops who are trained in Cop City, they're going to be released back into your community. And those cops, you know, they're going to be in your police department. And that's going to affect your police culture. So this sort of hyper militarization of these police.
Even several of the cops in the Scorpion unit that were involved in the Tyree Nichols had come from Atlanta.
Oh, interesting.
And when we talked about before that policing reflects the community in the sense that Cop City is a creation of massive wealth inequality. Absolutely. It only shows you, you know, they're not training cops to be better working with the community. They're training cops to militarize police us. So that's,
and
you know.
I think there are also some major corporations that are involved in the project, bizarre. Like Kellogg's and like Coca-Cola. Like, why are they involved in Cop City?
There are, I don't remember which ones. I think maybe Citibank or Bank of America. But
Citibank,
one of the efforts that the protesters were doing was to try and pressure those companies into withdrawing their funding and their support. Because you can actually pressure the cops are not going to be pressured to worry about their brand that much, whereas I think Bank of America might. But of course, we should also mention that in these protests, the cops have assassinated a forest defender, and they continue. The latest thing is they arrested several people, and they're charging them with domestic terrorism, including a legal observer.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, that after there was the arrest, I think, of roughly 5 people for domestic terrorism in Cop City back in December of 2022, I shouldn't be surprised that it's happening again and it's being weaponized against these activists. They scooped up a legal observer from the Southern Poverty Law Center. They grabbed up some festival goers, kids who were out there just to dance, people who weren't there necessarily for any particular political agenda. And the problem is that this is an extension of the U.S. Patriot Act. I think it's actually Section 802, which was broadened to allow sweeping in the sort of a very nebulously defined form of civil disobedience and allowing those folks charged with that to be charged with domestic terrorism. And as of course, you know, you can imagine a vandalism charge carries much different consequences than a domestic terrorism charge. And what's interesting is that I was taking a little look at the U.S. Patriot Act, and there's another aspect that can be weaponized against these folks, and that is asset forfeiture. So they can actually take the assets, freeze the assets of the young person involved, the activist involved, festival goer involved. And if that individual is connected to an organization, let's say Greenpeace, for example, that organization can also potentially have their assets frozen because they would be planning, organizing, helping, sheltering, et cetera, the person who is the activist representing them or who works for their organization. So this can have an incredibly chilling effect on civil disobedience and these forms of activism.
Yeah, that's a great point about civil asset forfeiture. The police now steal more from people than is stolen in street crime. So the police are stealing more than your average person out on the street. Now that doesn't account for how much Citibank steals, but
that's a whole other level of theft.
Yeah. Someone else, Teresa, is asking about, so right now, obviously we have the train derailment, the catastrophe in Ohio and Palestine, Ohio, and Aaron Brockovich has been out there organizing the community to fight back against that. And so now Aaron Brockovich apparently has been put on the Ohio police terrorist list. I did see this, an article about this. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on this increasing usage of the word terrorist. I mean, I guess you gave.
Yeah, well, it was really interesting. We have a really interesting case we just reported on with a cop watcher in Texas, Fort Worth, Texas, Manuel Mata, who attended the trial of the cop who killed Antiana Jefferson, right?
Yeah, Aaron Dean.
Yeah, Aaron Dean. Mm-hmm. And he was attending the trial with several activists, and after Aaron Dean had been sentenced to 12 years for murdering someone, 12 years. The defense attorney was allowed to call Mr. Mata and 5 other activists as a witness. And when Mr. Mata refused to be sworn as a witness, he was arrested. But then his defense attorney said to the mainstream media that Mr. Mata is being considered for charges of it was domestic terrorism or terroristic threats. Terroristic threats is another one. So I think we need to examine the language of this, like the language of using the idea of terrorist, right? It's become almost an easy way to take cop watchers, activists, anyone, and put them in this category. Then the mainstream media turns out this narrative terrorists. And when people think terrorists, they're like, oh my God, it's like an escalation of nomenclature to create this idea that people who dissent are actually a threat to some sort of idea of a democratic society, and it's horrifying. It's really, really, really horrifying. But it also shows the power. I mean, the Ohio State Police can turn like one of the most venerated activists in the history of this country and call them a terrorist. People have to realize. One of the most interesting things that I always encounter from people is this idea. Well, I never really thought about it until it happened to me. Right. And I think, it's incumbent upon us to really resist this kind of escalation of criminality amongst people who are just dissenting on a system, like you point out, kills 1,200 people a year.
It's the attacks ongoing against people who try and even remotely hold police accountable is just gut wrenching. And luckily, you guys are filling some of that void to actually get some of this message out there. I know you said in your 4-year anniversary special that they wanted to shut you down. What were the efforts to shut you down?
Oh God, there were so many.
There's quite a few. I mean, quite a few.
I would say one of the most, what would be the most acute one? I think the most acute one was when we were doing a documentary about there was an African-American police chief, the first in this small town in Pocomoke. And he came from Baltimore City, and he hated Baltimore City's militarized policing. So he started community policing, and where he would walk in the neighborhoods and force all his officers to walk the neighborhoods instead of driving around, and just change the whole tenor of the police department. And so he was fired for mysterious reasons, and then later on, I think a retaliatory prosecution for not charging someone in an accident that occurred. So he didn't charge him. So they go after him for 4 years. But we were reporting on it, and we were trying to interview people, and they swept us up in a case with a grand jury where they're investigating us, where they were investigating how long it took us to drive places, where they took my phone records.
Really?
Figured out, figured they wrote about me, and they put me in my book in the sentencing guidelines as if I committed a freaking crime because I was trying to report on a corrupt prosecution. And it was pretty scary though, because I was told to get a lawyer, that I might be dragged in front of the grand jury, that I might be indicted. I was told by the attorneys for interviewing people. It was just like, you could tell that they just didn't want us reporting about this anymore because they were trying to go after this guy. And I think it was primarily because of the community policing aspect of it. He wasn't arresting everybody. And it's very interesting to see how law enforcement responds to that kind of, when someone tries to change policing to make it more humane, they fight back. There's more support for units like Scorpions units than there are support for cops walking around a neighborhood and getting to know the people.
I would just add to that. I was thinking of the variety of ways, of course you get, officers and their acolytes, flagging your YouTube videos or trolling you or whatever. But I was thinking about when Stephen and I were working on a series of investigative reports about Dr. David Fowler, who is a Maryland medical examiner who rose to national prominence because he testified at the George Floyd trial that it was most likely that George Floyd died from cardiac arrest exacerbated by carbon monoxide exhaust coming from the police vehicle, as opposed to a knee on his neck. So that medical examiner, finally, the rest of the world heard what we had been saying for a decade, which is this medical examiner goes out of his way to unfound police, to basically rule undetermined or accidental any interactions with the police and the public that lead to death that are suspect and probably should be ruled a homicide. So that's the Dr. David Fowler we were dealing with. And essentially, his press information officer didn't like the reporting we were doing and called up our editor and tried to get us fired. Essentially, like literally said, you've got to get rid of these people. They're terrible people. You should fire them. But I will say this, that same press information officer, only, I think it was last year or about a year and a half ago, had to ask us what cases we thought should be reviewed and audited that Dr. David Fowler handled that perhaps should be considered homicides. So that same person who tried to get us fired over a decade later, had to eat a little bit of crow and realize that the office that he was representing was actually preventing our community from being able to hold police accountable in the most purposeful way. Not only did they prevent, they held off, they wouldn't give families autopsy reports, they wouldn't give them information. There was incredible lack of transparency. But even if you got the information you needed and this was an accidental death, this was an undetermined death, there's no investigation. There's no criminal proceedings that can move forward. You have no chance at police accountability. And that's what Dr. David Fowler was doing to Baltimore residents and Maryland residents every single day for over 20 years.
And that's how you end up with that, the numbers in that study that was in the Lancet Medical Journal showing that cops kill twice as many as we think they kill because of exactly that. Most of them are, he died of a cardiac arrest. Well, what caused the cardiac arrest? Who knows?
Right. Right. Was it the taser? Was it the two cops kneeling on their chest while they were in a prone position? That didn't have anything to do with it. Yeah.
Right. Someone else would like to know what you both, whether you both believe in, and you mentioned this already a little bit, Glenn Ford of Black Agenda reports community control of police is a way to defund the police and take power away from them.
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, of course, so the thing to remember, I think it's really interesting about the way the fund police question has been framed, because the way policing is treated in most communities, including Baltimore, is that there's an unlimited funding for police. I remember a long time ago, I wrote a series of articles on overtime abuse. And, there were guys who were supposedly working 365 days a year, 17 hours a day. It was clear that people were just abusing the system and stealing money from them. And there was a council person, he said, I think the problem here is we're not funding you enough. How much money do you need? What do you need? It was just astonishing and shocking to me. And we continue to have this idea that somehow, there's an unlimited amount of money to fund police, but it's really about choices. And those choices are like the type of thing that Mr. Ford is talking about, empowering the community. So if you're investing in our city, we invest $600 million in policing and $300 million in education. What's going to be the more powerful institution? policing or education? What's going to create a more powerful citizenry, a community that can push back, a community that can hold police accountable? It's where the money goes. The choices you make is the community you're going to have. And if it all goes into policing, you're going to have a community that produces 2 series about policing for HBO so they can make millions of dollars off you, but not a community that educates its citizenry or provides a good housing or things like that. So I approve of any, I think it is wise for people to examine any situation in funding, because funding is power. So funding education more than police isn't defunding the police, it's funding the power of the community.
I thought you made an excellent statement. The only thing I would add to that is that where you direct your funding tells everybody what your priorities in the community are. If you pour money into policing, you're saying to the community that your children are violent, we're afraid of you, we want to control you. Pouring money into education, pouring money into beautification. There have been studies that show that beautifying areas helps reduce crime. Mm-hmm. Of course, education and support helps reduce crime. And Lee actually did this really wonderful video, I think, using the data produced by Jerry Ratcliffe, the criminologist. Is a great video that showed that there are a lot of interactions with the public that the police do that could easily be handled by someone else. For example, traffic infractions, here's your ticket, no need for a gun.
Right.
Calls for information. There are just so many different things that we could offload from the police department that you don't necessarily need someone with a gun and a taser to show up to. So I think there's a lot of ways we can, allocate those resources in a much more effective way.
And just a week after I did that video, the LAPD union, I guess, put out a statement saying that due to lack of funds, by their words, lack of funds and late emergency response times, here's a list of things we want to no longer be called for. And they put a long list of mental health calls, dog, animal calls, and all these things. And at the end of it, they said, look, we're not mental health professionals. We're not nurses. We're not social workers. And it's funny that in many of the regards, of my video saying we don't need 99% of police they shouldn't be doing 99% of what they do. The police agree with part of it. Like,
I think they do.
Yeah, but to me, to get down to the deeper systemic reason for that is because at the heart of it, the real reason the police are out there is kind of to protect the status quo and to protect our class system, et cetera. It's not really that we need a guy with a gun to handle a rogue dog that's gotten loose. It's just that our systems, the ruling elite want to have a lot of foot soldiers out on the streets at all times, kind of.
Yeah, and I mean, you have a country that's become more and more economically unequal. That creates tensions, and that means more and more people are suffering, right? Because someone's losing. That is a kind of a zero-sum game when it comes to how much income goes to a smaller and smaller percentage. That is a zero-sum game, and people suffer. And people, there's just an interesting article in New York Times about how poverty hasn't changed that much, the poverty rate, despite federal programs. And that's because of exploitation, economic exploitation. Like, for instance, payday loans where, people are paying 600% interest or, overdraft fees. So in order that system creates a tremendous amount of instability amongst working class people. And that instability has to be policed, I think, to get people to really continue to accept it. I think we accept inequality primarily because policing tells us a story that it's inevitable.
Yes.
And that it's somehow just, because what is cops but just going around and harassing poor working class people? I mean, the show Cops, that's what it was. It was an ongoing epistolatory police narrative about how poor people or people working class didn't deserve anything better. And that's the entirety of it, and that's why elites find policing so attractive, because it's constantly reinforcing the message that the unequal share of income that they get is actually deserved.
Yes. Absolutely.
Yeah. Can you talk a little about the connection between how our nation is policed and the massive prison industrial complex? We have over 2 million people in prisons across the country. And many of them, it's that they went in for something small and they get caught up in the system and can't get out. And this is not the norm in developed countries. They don't have millions of people in prison. We have one of the highest per capita rates, definitely top 5, I believe. And there's other countries where it's a tiny number of individuals in prison, and it's just a very different system.
Well, I mean, one of the things we were talking about, and Taya's done a lot of work on this, actually, is prison labor. Because a lot of people, I think, the way the country evolved is after the country couldn't feed off slavery anymore, it just invented a prison system.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, the Black codes were specifically created so that Black people could be taken in for vagrancy and taken in and have their bodies utilized by the former plantation owners, essentially. And so this continued use of bodies, just grinding them up and extracting wealth from them, didn't stop with slavery. And this sort of chain gang labor continued. And as a matter of fact, our former comrade Eddie Conway, he was a political prisoner for 44 years, unjustly imprisoned, and he actually started a prison union, if you can imagine, to try to help the folks inside try to get better working conditions, actually get some decent pay. Because the thing is, even today, but people are being paid like 22 cents an hour for their work, or $1 a day for their work. And then considering how much it costs to call a loved one, how much it costs to buy just some decent food to supplement your diet, how much it costs to buy a comb or hygiene project.
Or make a phone call.
Absolutely.
$7 a minute.
Hygiene products, shampoo, all these things that are part of the necessities of life. And so it's just this horrible wheel where people's labor is being extracted. And the problem is that someone can have a failure to appear for a traffic infraction and end up in jail. Or you can have just a couple little pieces on your record, and the next thing you know, you're doing a 6-month bid. Well, God help you if you have a violent interaction in prison. Prison's one of the most violent places on the planet. So let's say you have to defend yourself from a violent interaction, or it turns out one of the guards just doesn't like looking at you. And the next thing you know, you've got another year tacked onto your stay. So it's very disturbing the way that they're able to essentially use slave labor again. And they make the rest of the country, the mainstream media does this, and a lot of them are aligned with the establishment politicians and with the police departments, and they form a narrative where these are the undeserving. These are criminals. So you shouldn't care what happens to them beyond those gates. It doesn't matter. They deserve this. This is part of their punishment. Well, I thought this was supposed to be about rehabilitation. I thought this was about taking people who were broken, perhaps, and helping make them better. And that's not the way it's done here. It's breaking people, and it's destroying communities and hollowing them out.
And one of the ways that this continues to be a class issue is if you have the big time lawyers, you're not going to get locked up for any of that stuff. You're not even going to get locked up for far larger crimes. Even the Sacklers who killed hundreds of thousands with their opioid epidemic, they didn't go to prison. They paid a fine and move on. So it's just a very different system. And speaking of, I'm glad you brought that up, Taya, about, well, these are criminals, so therefore forget them. It doesn't matter. Why should we stand up for their rights? I saw on one of your interviews, Stephen, you talked about how the way the mainstream media often covers many of these police interactions while someone's getting arrested is they start off by saying, well, did this person have a criminal record, to kind of lay the groundwork of whether you should care about this human or not. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I used to get into fights in the aughts was every time I tried to write a story about police brutality, the first thing my editor would ask is, does this person have a criminal record? And of course, in Baltimore, as Taya pointed out, we were arresting about 100,000 people a year.
Mm-hmm.
So everybody had sort of, I wouldn't say criminal, but they've been arrested. And they always wanted me to mention that at the beginning of the story, because, that was a way to signal to the audience, whatever happened afterwards, this person is a criminal and doesn't deserve rights. And, the thing was, I would argue with them about someone just being arrested and the charges drop, which means they never were convicted of a crime, and they would still want me to include it. And this was a paper owned by a billionaire. And so that's the whole point. It's like, a scarlet letter As Taya points about political efficacy, you know, people disengage from the system when they get arrested. They become, you know, they don't want to vote. They can't vote in a lot of cases, although Maryland finally stopped that. But, you know, it's just become a great way to, you know, take away the political power and the way to marginalize a person's, you know, our criminal law is based around the idea that if you're accused of a crime, that crime should be considered in its singular, you know, in just when what happened there. You don't bring up someone's criminal history. But, you know, in journalism, that's not what happens. The mainstream media is, you know, is like, okay, these are all the markers on this person. They have less rights. And I think that goes back to what you talked about, which is the economic inequality and the elites and wanting to kind of segregate us into the haves and the have-nots, and the have-nots are not deserving. So it goes back to that. But yeah, you know, it's a huge problem, and it continues. Go ahead.
Oh, the only thing I'd want to add to that is that sort of thinking of taking a look at someone's criminal record and therefore determining whether or not they're a worthy person also happens to victims of crimes, in particular Black women, women of color, Native women, Latino women. So if you, let's say, have a theft charge, check fraud, maybe a solicitation charge, and the police find your body, I know for a fact there are officers who say, well, it's a risky line of work. And really no further investigation is done. And then the mainstream media participates in this by not prioritizing and highlighting the stories of these women when they die. Something that we came across, because we've done an investigative cold case podcast, something that we came across is that there were folks who were interested in some of our stories, but they were looking for perfect victims. This person couldn't have any sort of criminal history, or it wasn't going to end up in the Netflix series, or you know what I mean? So they were looking for perfect victims. So perfect victims are highlighted by the media, as well as you have to be a perfect victim in a lot of cases to have your death or your assault investigated.
And I feel like there's a lot more that can be said about the way the mainstream media just covers police in general. One of the ones I did a segment recently when the Tyree Nichols murder came out of Meet the Press, having a panel, and there were some things said about, you know, this is a horrific moment and things, but 70% of the discussion on the panel was about how wonderful to see, it was Memphis, right? To see the Memphis police really quickly analyze what had happened and arrest these officers. And so it became kind of a love fest for what a great job they did weeding out these bad apples after a murder.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and that, you know, this is the question that plagues us, and it makes me so angry, because they were the police department that why were they asking questions about why there was a unit that was allowed to do these type of things? It wasn't like they weren't aware of it. Other people came forward who had been driving or parked, and people had jumped out. And it drives me freaking crazy, because it's like, just because you were transparent about something. First of all, it wasn't because you wanted to. It's because anyone who saw that video witnessed a murder. So it wasn't, if they could have found a way to cover that up or somehow, but there were body cameras. Let's imagine 10, 12 years ago, before there were body cameras. What do you think the Memphis police would have done then? It would have been like the George Floyd press release, which said, you know, a man suffered an incident during being detained. So, but most importantly, why aren't these people ever held accountable? Like the chief. I think the chief should be charged to a certain extent. Until we start charging the top people, the chief did nothing but what she had to do. She had no choice. That body camera footage was horrific, and but if she had any way to parse it, she would have. She's the one that authorized that freaking unit, and you're saying in a militarized organization that she's not responsible for the actions of her so-called troops, which was what they were. This drives me crazy. I'm totally in agreement with you. I can't stand the lack of accountability to the people at the top. Until that happens, things won't change.
Stephen's done a lot of investigative reporting on how these groups work, in particular, these specialized units, whether they're supposed to be for drug interdiction, traffic enforcement. It seems like there is always a trail of bloodshed and violence that goes along with these specified groups. But prior to it, this is not, let me just say this, it's not a one-off situation. It was always leading up to a death as brutal as Tyree Nichols. You cannot think that that is the first time those officers beat a suspect.
Well, they've been dragging people out of cars. I mean, that's
pulling someone out of a car. That's beating a suspect.
That's like American. That. I mean, is that what we think? I mean, I'm amazed at the tolerance of the public for this kind of stuff, because that's the tactics of an authoritarian regime to drag someone out of their private property without pretext. To me, is just, it's horrifying. And so the police chief at least should be fired. You know, I think they should be fired summarily until you find someone who's going to tell people to police constitutionally. And, you know, a lot of communities like Baltimore beset with violence justify abandoning the Constitution because of violence. But then what do you end up with? You know, you end up never addressing the underlying conditions that create, you know, violence. And then you also end up with a city that really isn't constitutional. Yeah. So I don't know, man. It's disheartening.
Very much so.
Taya, I know you have to run in a second, so I'll direct this question to you, and then you can head out, and I'll finish up the hour with Stephen. But you mentioned.
Well, sorry, we're joined at the hip.
Do you have to go too?
Well, yeah. He's my photog. Well, we take turns photog.
I thought you had something unfilming related to do. Okay.
Yeah, well, no, we have a couple stories we have to cover. We gotta.
Well, we have to.
Okay, it's fine. It's fine. We'll do. Well, now that I know I only have one more question, let me make it a good one. Yeah, I was going to ask about police militarization, which you mentioned, but we haven't kind of dug into it. The use of SWAT teams, which, you know, began 30 years ago or something, but has just, you know, like a hockey stick gone up. The usage of it. You know, what are the impacts of simply the use of this weaponry and just carrying it around? I mean, how does it change the interactions simply to have cops with these kind of weapons?
Oh, I mean, you go.
Well, no, I was just going to say, no. But remember, we just did in our story, you know, so you make first, just to point out the stats on that, you know, what was only 7% of SWAT team raids, and the ACLU did analysis in 1 year were related to like barricade situations
or hostage situations. Only 7%.
So there's that, right? 93% of them are conducted in the Breonna Taylor type situation where, you know, I think they just feel like dressing up. But, you know, you can't, it's weird to me. I know Tay and I have talked about this. You know, when you talked about Chase Kazugawa and these cops out in the middle of nowhere, they're just like geared up, like they're ready to go to war. You know, they got vests, they got like canteens.
Yeah, and they have all these like a sort of like I don't know, is it called like a bolero? Like they all the bullets across their chest, and they're just all girded up like they're going to war, and they're just going down a lonely desert street to a guy whose car's broken down. Yeah. How it's so intimidating. And I just wonder, you know, I'll hear officers talk about community policing, working with the community, building trust with the community. Well, when you come into the community with like full riot gear, wearing camouflage, having a large gun strapped on you, and then having barrels of a variety of pepper sprays and pepper balls and tasers, what message are you sending to the community? It's like, I'm here to serve you and keep you safe. I'm here to keep you in your place. Well, I think the message is obvious.
And I also think honestly, and this is part of human nature, I think cops like to dress up. I think they do. I think they like to put on, soldier, they like to play army. And, you know, they put all this stuff on them, and, you know, they go on raids that have nothing to do with, you know, extracting a violent subject, but usually, you know, a small amount of marijuana or some stupid thing. But it's very dangerous, and it's very, you know, destructive to a community. And Baltimore is plagued by that kind of stuff, where raid after raid after raid. We'll drive around Baltimore. Has it improved? I mean, that's the thing we never asked. No. Has policing ever made a community really better? Has it? I've seen it in rare instances, like I said, down in Pocomoke, through community policing, but no one wants to do that because it's not fun. It's not fun to be able to. Oh, can
I just mention when you said it's not fun? So when we were talking about community policing in Pocomoke City, Maryland, on the Eastern Shore, this is a town of like roughly 4,300 people. And so when Chief Kelvin Sewell had his tenure there for about 4.5 years, violent crime and property crime dropped by 80%. There wasn't a single homicide under his tenure. Okay, so it worked. And what he did was make the officers actually get out their patrol car. But yes, I know, get out of their patrol car and walk. But the problem was the officers didn't want to get out of the cars. They wanted to stay in the cars on the side of the road, getting speeders and hoping to get a big drug bust, you know, and to like pull over a car. They wanted to do fishing expeditions.
There's a highway that goes through Pocomoke, and and Chief Sewell said the biggest problem he had was getting his officers off the highway, even when he told them not to be there. They just wanted to sit on the highway and try to pull over, you know,
they were hoping they were going to end up with some big bus that they could brag about.
But so the point is, it's like, it's kind of like we're playing into their, you know, it was Snow Hill that had like a big personnel carrier, like almost like a tank. I mean, a town of like 3,000 people has like a tank.
It was like a Bearcat, I think.
Yeah, Bearcat, right. You Google it. You go around like small towns with like 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 people had this huge military because of 1030 program, I think.
Well, yeah, the MRAPs through the 1033,
yeah. So 1033, thank you. And you know, so I think it's partly we're letting cops just, they want to be warriors. It's more fun for them, and you know that militarization is probably the worst thing that's happened to American policing, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
Because it leads to a lot of the problems. Just like the guys, you know, they're wearing masks over their face. You know, the guys, the people in Scorpion unit. I mean, masked people going and pulling people out of cars. I mean, think America for a second. Think about what you're tolerating. And I'm not blaming, I know there's so many people who are concerned. It's not, but it's just amazing to me that a country that purports to be a democracy would have this anti-democratic impulse running throughout it, including what you were saying, mass incarceration, you know, militarized policing. I mean, it's like we have a little authoritarian regime operating inside our democracy, kind of pulling it apart, you know, piece by piece over time, while we all sit around and go, oh, let's watch Cops tonight, or let's watch Live PD, or let's watch The Wire. You know, because isn't this interesting? Go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just thinking that sort of militarized policing, and that's the warrior cop mentality, the Killology cop mentality, the type of training that they're going to receive at Cop City down in Atlanta. That type of policing doesn't necessarily produce more effective cops. We know it can produce aggressive cops, and we also know it can produce really fearful cops. Because I was thinking about some of the, and I've seen more body camera footage of brutality than anyone should have to in their lifetime. But one that stood out to me was when LeVar Jones got shot back in 2014. It was in Columbia, South Carolina. And this was for not putting on his seatbelt while pulling out of a gas station. It was supposed to be for a seatbelt infraction. And so the officer asked LeVar, he's standing there outside the car. And the officer says, "Get your license." And he says, "Okay." And he reaches into the car. And within 2 seconds, the officer says, stop moving, and fires off 3 or 4 shots at LeVar. Now, this is at a gas station. Luckily, he missed most of the shots, but one hit LeVar Jones and hit him in the hip. And the entire time, you can hear LeVar Jones saying, "What did I do? I'm sorry. What did I do?" And he said, "Well, you reached." And he said, "You told me to get my license." So this type of training doesn't necessarily just produce violent cops. It produces scared cops. And those are even more dangerous.
That's a good point, yeah.
All great points. It's been a pleasure talking to you so much. And I really hope people check out your show, the Police Accountability Report on the Real News Network. And keep doing great work.
Thank you. It was such a pleasure to meet you. And I also really enjoy your work.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Hope to see you soon.
Yep. Okay. Take care.
Take care.
All right. There you go. Taya Graham and Stephen Janis with the Real News Network. Definitely check out their show. I'll finish up the hour here by talking about a few of your statements. And they were talking at the end there about the militarization of police. And I've emailed a bit with one officer or he said he used to be an officer, but he quit because he couldn't handle how terrible it was. And he said, there's basically 2 types of cops on a lot of these forces, maybe not rural, but I guess city forces. And that is those who are ex-military and those who aren't. And the ones who are ex-military tend to lead the cops, tend to lead the departments. And so many of the ex-military are viewing this as a war situation. I'm at war with the American people in many ways. And those who aren't ex-military are kind of following along and going, "Oh, that's the way to behave. That's the way to do it right, so that you look tough and you aren't threatened, etc." So you do end up with basically a paramilitary force walking around the streets of America at war with the American people. Let's see. What I wanted to respond to a couple of these. Sorry that, I didn't get to all the questions while the guests were here. So, but let's see. William Garrison made the point, who are you going to complain to about abuse by cops, make it illegal and a crime to do so. And that's what a lot of the footage that they show in the police accountability report, that's what a lot of the footage shows. It shows that people who try, and this isn't always the case. I don't want to tell you not to complain about bad cops, but many times people who try and complain about bad cops, try and put a complaint in, try and film them, try and get their badge number. They're often harassed, threatened, arrested. And it does become a situation of, well, who's going to police the police? Who's going to police these oftentimes idiots with guns? And sadly, there's very little accountability. And so you then turn to the media and say, well, the media will at least highlight these abuses. But it's pretty fucking rare that the media is going to highlight these abuses. And so that's why I love the show that we just highlighted, the Police Accountability Report, what they're doing there. Here's another one from 7 Word Mary. Every cop must undergo mandatory random drug testing. And so that may be true. First of all, I imagine it's different in different departments. I imagine some departments, they may say they're random drug testing or not really. But all of that aside, while they may undergo random drug testing for things like cocaine and stuff, they are almost exclusively, because I've done segments on this, not undergoing testing for steroid abuse. And steroid abuse is, if you look down the symptoms of roid rage, what roid rage causes, and the list of brutal police officers, it lines up perfectly. It lines up like a glove. It's like quick to anger, poor decision making, violent, going into rages, becoming physical, all the things that you would say, oh, that's roid rage, is also what a, brutal police officer would do. And many times, and I used to have a joke about this, so I might as well do it here again if you haven't heard it, but a stand-up joke. But they don't even test police officers for steroid abuse after they've done something brutal, after they've murdered someone, after they've beaten someone. They don't even test them then. So lots of times, like, we don't know the Scorpion unit there that killed Tyree Nichols. Do we know how many of them were abusing steroids? The estimates are that 25% of police in urban areas are abusing steroids, but no one's testing for it. Even after a crime, there's no testing for it. So you end up with these uniquely strong, uniquely rageful, uniquely poor decision makers policing our cities. And sorry, I haven't got to the joke part yet. The joke part was the stand-up bit I used to do was, we don't care whether our cops are abusing steroids or abusing drugs, yet we test for steroids in our athletes. Like, whether a guy jumped over a stick really fast, well, did he jump over naturally, or what, did he have some assistance? Is that a legitimate record, running really fast or throwing a stick really far? We're really concerned about whether someone's doing steroids during that, but we don't care if they're doing steroids while they murder someone. Like, you watch the Olympics and they're like, wow, that guy threw that stick really far. Let's find out if he's on drugs or if it's a legit record. So with our cops, why are we not like, wow, that guy threw that grandma really far. Let's find out if that's a legit record. Anyway, that was my stand-up joke. So I realize it's not as in this kind of live stream back and forth, not as entertaining. But let's see if I see real quick any other comments I should check in on. Some people just saying it's excellent. They had a great time. They appreciate the interviews. One person is mentioning body cams, and Taya and Steven mentioned body cams. And body cams at times can be really important, right? We've learned a lot from body cams. One of the things actually we learned in the Cobb City events from a body cam was that the police who went down there, they murdered an innocent unarmed protester named Tortuguita. They murdered that person, and we now know from the body, and they said, oh, well, he was being threatening. They were being threatening. We thought they had a gun or whatever the cops said. Now we know from the body cam footage, you can overhear two cops saying, you shot one of your own? I think they shot one of their own. Meaning the reason the cops ended up firing at this protester and killing him was because they had shot each other. One of the cops had shot a fellow cop, thinking, I guess, that it was a protester with a gun or something. And then the response fire, it seems obvious now from that body cam audio, is what killed the protester. So, so occasionally body cams are really significant. However, they do not solve, as we've learned, they do not solve brutal policing. Occasionally they give us information that we needed to know, but they don't solve brutal policing because it's far deeper than that. And cops will find ways to turn off their body cams. They'll cover their body cams. There's a million ways. Sometimes the video just doesn't get released. So if the department as a whole is corrupt, then they'll just erase the body cam footage after some shit goes down. So there's a lot of problems with body cams in general. They don't solve all these problems. Okay, I think I'm going to wrap up there, but we do these interviews regularly with Behind the Headlines and twice a week, and also do the most censored news. And I hope you will support us because we need your support. Join up at patreon.com/behindtheheadlines, and also click subscribe and tell people about it. It's all at youtube.com/behindtheheadlines. Click notify. And if you want to join the free email list, which will get you notified about a lot of these, or text the word censored to 33777. That's if you're in America. You can also sign up at leecamp.com. But if you're in America, text the word censored to 33777. All right. I will see you soon. Keep fighting.